What is Dungeons & Dragons? It can be a game, but it can also be a story. It can be relaxing, easygoing, simple, but it can also be challenging, clever, and testing. It can be used to hang out with friends, but it can also be used to meet new ones. Or is it all of these things? Before we look at Dungeons & Dragons today, let's take a quick look at how it got started. October 1970, Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Gary Gygax, a tabletop gaming enthusiast, lost his job as an insurance underwriter. Being a fan of tabletop gaming, Gygax used his interest to make a new living designing board games. This proved to be unsustainable at first, and Gygax resorted to cobbling shoes for a steady income. One of the games Gygax published around this time was Chainmail, a medieval-era miniature war game. After Chainmail was published, Dave Arneson used the rules of Chainmail for his own personal game campaign, adding his own rules to it as well. Seeing the improvements that Arneson made to Chainmail, Gygax saw the appeal of tabletop role-playing games. Gygax and Arneson collaborated on developing a fantasy game that would later become Dungeons & Dragons, or commonly abbreviated as D&D. What made D&D stand out among other war games is who you were playing as. Other war games around the time would have you play as a generic soldier or a formation of soldiers. In D&D, the players are playing as a specific character that they made themselves. The success of Dungeons & Dragons led to multiple versions of the game being published, and by 1981, 3 million people were playing worldwide. But this success came with controversy.
In fact, in my presentation, I show many pictures from the inside the books, just to show the images of this game. I mean, the gruesomeness of this game and the occult link to it.
Early in the life of D&D, the game received negative attention and was seen as devil worship among Christian groups. D&D was also referenced as the blame for many murders and suicides among adolescents.
Last April, an 18-year-old art student named Mary Towie was killed by 2 friends, Ron Adcox and Darren Molitor. All 3 played Dungeons & Dragons together, Darren intensively, up to 16 hours a day, sometimes sitting up all night.
This may sound crazy today since today's culture is so used to Satanism from movies and video games. But back in the early 80s, there really wasn't anything like Dungeons & Dragons where people actively participated in the story. Although these periods of negative attention were usually short-lived. But what actually happens during a D&D game? The game is made up of a group of people, some dice, paper, and rulebooks. One person in the group is the Dungeon Master, and they act as the storyteller of the group, creating their own story or using a pre-designed campaign. These stories can last up to 1 gaming session, or they can go multiple gaming sessions over the course of months, even years. The rest of the players in the group create their own characters to interact in the Dungeon Master's world. Players choose from different classes such as paladins, clerics, and rogues to complement how they want to play the game. Between the players and the Dungeon Master, this acts as a form of collaborative storytelling. Because outside of combat, players are acting out how their characters react to situations, and the Dungeon Master has to change what happens in the story based off what the player chooses. This is where Dungeons & Dragons becomes more than just a game. It becomes a story shared between everyone in the group. The stories told from these games are grand and epic adventures of slaying the villain at the end. They can be silly and funny moments like when the group rogue accidentally alerts all the guards in an area. They can also be sad and tragic stories, like when the paladin falls in combat protecting a local village. This makes Dungeons & Dragons more than just a game.